Okay.
You should give it like 5 seconds and you're good to start.
Okay. Okay, ready?
Yep.
Okay. Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today for a conversation about three intersecting realities: human rights, climate change, and media coverage. Today's program is sponsored by the Tompkins County Office of Human Rights and the Park Center for Independent Media of Ithaca College. I'm Ken Clarke, Director of the Office of Human Rights. I want to acknowledge Professor Raza Rumi, Director of the Park Center, for his department's co-sponsorship of this program. An exploration of the intertwining of human rights, climate change, and media coverage is often not part of the public conversation about an increasingly warming planet, the rising intensity of hurricanes and tropical storms, seasonal weather patterns that are unpredictable, such as recent snowstorms instead of rain in winter and spring in northern and southern California, the melting of polar ice caps, or the debate between those sounding the alarm about climate and those who think that climate change is a farce. Nonetheless, as we approach the 53rd annual celebration of Earth Day on Saturday, our speaker will elaborate on an evidence-based assertion that climate change is emerging as one of the greatest human rights violations in human history. I'll quote his words: "Extreme weather and sea level rise are already forcing millions of people, most of them poor and people of color, to abandon their homes and move elsewhere in search of safe living conditions. Thus, climate change is a definitive human rights issue. Additionally, the quality of the coverage of climate change is also a human rights concern. Article 19 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights highlights the right of freedom of opinion and expression without interference, and to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas through any media and regardless of frontiers. Accurate, thoroughgoing coverage, which interrogates, raises questions, considers perspectives not always captured or examined in mainstream media, is essential to the transmission of information. Information is the oxygen of societies that define themselves as democracies. In a democratic society, media should serve as the watchdog of democracy." Our guest speaker is eminently equipped to explain the intersection of human rights, climate change, and media coverage. A longtime investigative journalist, he is the co-founder and executive director of Covering Climate Now, which mission is to, quote, "help media colleagues cover the defining story of our time, climate change, with the rigor and urgency it deserves." He has covered climate change for nearly 3.5 decades and has reported from 25 countries in books he has authored about climate change, such as Earth Odyssey and Hot, and as well as numerous print and broadcast media. He is also the author of the acclaimed book On Bended Knee, the Press and the Reagan Presidency, and the book A Day in the Life, the Music and Artistry of the Beatles. When I was growing up in Baltimore in the 1960s, our speaker's father, Mark Hertsgaard, was the most prominent and respected evening news anchor in the city, working for WBAL-TV from 1958 to 1973. In the late 80s, while living in San Francisco, I read with great interest his son's first book, On Bended Knee, then found out he was living in the city. We finally met in 1993 when I invited him to speak at Penn State. And he is no stranger to Ithaca, having spoken here at least twice, as I can recall, over the last 2 decades. So it is my pleasure to introduce Mark Hertsgaard to you this afternoon. After Mark gives his comments, we will open up for questions and answers. You may submit your questions or comments through the chat function in YouTube, and we will read those off to you as many as we can. So Mark, the floor is yours. We welcome you back again, at least in a cyber way, to Ithaca.
Well, Ken, thank you so very much indeed for bringing me back here. It's great to see you again. And
Yes.
It's really nice to be here in Ithaca virtually. I wish I were there in person. I wish we could all be seeing each other face to face in real life. But I just want to say that I have a lot of fondness for Ithaca. I have spent a good bit of time there over the years, and also great admiration for the work that so many people there are doing on climate change, on human rights, on social justice issues generally. And I was very proud to see recently, and tickled, frankly, to see the Rolling Stone magazine article about Ithaca. I'm sure you're all familiar with it. The piece that's, if you haven't seen it, this is the issue. As Ed Sheeran on the cover. Their special Earth Day issue, and the headline is Ithaca's all-electric gamble, and it describes the city's plan to basically achieve carbon neutrality by 2030 by carbonizing 6,000 buildings across the city.
Awesome.
And so I was very tickled to see that. I have to, in full disclosure, I have to mention I had a small role in getting that article, making that article happen, because Rolling Stone is one of our key partners in covering climate now. And let me just say a couple of words about covering climate now, because it directly relates to our topic today. So covering climate now is a global media collaboration of more than 500 partner news outlets across the United States and around the world. And together, those outlets reach a combined audience of some 2 billion people. That's billion. Wow. And we were founded 4 years ago this month by The Nation magazine, where I'm the environment correspondent, by the Columbia Journalism Review, which of course is housed at Columbia School of Journalism, which gives away the Pulitzer Prizes, and Bill Moyers, my longtime mentor, colleague, and hero, frankly. We came together to essentially break the climate silence that was prevailing within the mainstream media up until that. And the origin for this was a landmark United Nations climate science report that I'm sure many of you will remember, at least the headlines. This was in October of 2018. And the headlines that emerged from this report were 12 years to save the planet. And that was because scientists were saying that in order to safeguard human civilization going forward, we had to limit global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. And that was a big shift. Previously, the supposedly safe level was 2 degrees Celsius, which of course was not safe, but this new science was saying 1.5 is going to be bad enough. And if we're going to do that, the scientists said, we're going to have to really just transform the global economy. I was covering that press conference as a beat reporter for The Nation magazine. And the scientists were saying, okay, in order to cut emissions in half by 2030 and keep the 1.5 target in reach, we have to radically transform, those were the words, radically transform every major sector of the world economy. And they started listing the sectors: energy sector, obviously, transportation sector, agriculture sector, forestry sector, construction sector, finance sector, and they went on and on and on. And there was one sector that they never named, the media sector. And when I realized that, that was when the light bulb went off in my head. And I said to myself, if we don't radically transform the media sector and break the climate silence that has existed throughout the media for all these years, none of those other economic sectors are going to transform in time, for a very simple reason. And this is the theory of change that animates us at Covering Climate Now. The reason is that unless we break the climate silence and the media tells the people not only that we face a climate emergency, but also, equally important, that there are abundant solutions to that emergency, right? Solar and wind and so forth. Unless the public knows that, there will simply not be the public pressure on politicians, on governments, on corporations to make the rapid, far-reaching changes in behavior that are needed to safeguard our civilization from runaway climate change. So that was the origin of Covering Climate Now. And you see some of the results in this issue of Rolling Stone, which also has a terrific essay by Bill McKibben that I also suggested to them, which was, pardon me, let me get rid of that, which basically looks at what needs to happen and where the resistance is. And this also is part of our theme today. Essentially, in order to limit temperature rise to 1.5, we civilization, we humanity, we need to leave 90% of the fossil fuels, oil, coal, and gas, in the ground unburned. The problem is that represents trillions of dollars of money that Exxon and BP and other big fossil fuel companies right now have on their balance sheets. They are, basically it's paper wealth that they are telling their shareholders, you're going to get this money. So that's the problem. And I'm sure many of you in Ithaca are fully aware of this, but we have the solutions to climate change, the technical solutions, the behavioral solutions, the policy measures. We all know what needs to be done. The problem is we face a very rich and powerful, arguably the richest and most powerful industry in history that is determined to burn down the planet rather than sacrifice their profits. So that's one of the things that Covering Climate Now has been working on. And in fact, maybe the most important project that we've launched at Covering Climate Now, which we did in collaboration with the Guardian newspaper, is called Climate Crimes. And that we launched 2 years ago. I raised some money to have this project that seeks to put back into the center of the public conversation around climate change the fact that all of these companies, Exxon, BP, Chevron, Shell, have lied about climate change for 40 plus years now. They knew perfectly well, their own scientists were telling them that if we keep burning fossil fuels the way that their business plans foresaw, we would create an uninhabitable planet. And instead of sharing that information with the government, with other policymakers, with the public, and shifting or deciding what to do about it, they hid that information. Not only hid it, they lied about it. They acted like it was not true and tried to intimidate, I should say, any journalist or public official or others who insisted otherwise. So this is really, I think, at the heart of what we're talking about here. And I'm happy to say that a lot of what Covering Climate Now has done also has a very strong Ithaca connection. And in fact, Ken mentioned it in his introduction here. In addition to Bill Moyers and the Schumann Foundation, Covering Climate Now is very proud to say that we receive financial support from the Park Foundation, which of course is headquartered there in Ithaca and has been long-standing a voice for a truly independent media and public-minded media. So that's a lot of what we try and do at Covering Climate Now. And I'd like to just read a snippet of the piece that I wrote in The Guardian when we launched when we launched the Climate Crimes Project 2 years ago. Let me just call this up here. Because again, it gets to what we're talking about here today, crimes against humanity. So this is my piece in The Guardian from June of 2021, June 30. It begins as follows. Every person on Earth today is living in a crime scene. This crime has displaced or killed untold numbers of people around the world. It's caused countless billions of dollars in economic damage and ravaged vital ecosystems and wildlife. It has disproportionately affected already marginalized communities around the world, from farmers in coastal Bangladesh, where fast rising seas are salting the soil and slashing rice yields, to low-income residents of Houston, Chicago, and other cities, whose neighborhoods suffer much higher temperatures than the prosperous areas across town. This crime threatens today's young people most of all and calls into question the very survival of civilization. And yet the criminals responsible for this devastation are still at large. Indeed, they continue to perpetuate their crime and even make money from it, not least because their crime remains unknown to most of the public. I'll stop there. And that is the essence of the Climate Crimes Project. As I said, we need to bring that knowledge back into the public conversation around climate change. We know all that is true because of great investigative reporting that was done by the Los Angeles Times, by Inside Climate News, and by the Columbia Journalism School years ago. But when those stories, investigative stories, first broke in 2015, they got no pickup within the rest of the mainstream media. You could look in vain in the New York Times and the Washington Post, much less the big TV networks, ABC, CBS, and NBC, for any mention of that. And so the general public, I haven't seen any polling on this, but I would bet that if you polled the general American public today, less than 10% of them are aware that big oil has lied for 40 years about this, and that a big part of the reason that humanity as a whole now faces a climate emergency is because of those lies and the way those lies have blunted calls for policy reforms inside of Washington and so many other capitals across the United States and around the world. So the fact is that right now, because of those lies, all the rest of us are paying the price. We're paying sometimes with losing our homes, losing our health, losing our very lives. That is criminal, and I would argue that it is a crime that goes beyond the sort of, when we think about crime, the way the media usually covers it, it's not systemic crime, right? It's kidnapping or a murder or a rape of somebody downtown, and we follow the story like that. What would happen, just think of this as a thought experiment, what would happen though if the news media covered the climate story like a crime story, right? Like a crime story where we would talk about the crime and we would look at alleged perpetrators of that crime and look for the motives and look at how they're defending themselves. That would be a paradigm shift in how the media is covering this. And I'm proud to say that The Guardian is doing that. The Nation is doing that through Covering Climate Now. We are running this kind of coverage. And we are working at Covering Climate Now with big mainstream news organizations, including ABC, CBS, NBC, Reuters, Agence France Presse, very big outlets that, as I say, reach a combined audience of some 2 billion people around the world. We are urging them to look at this, at the climate story in this larger, more holistic way. But I would argue, and this is not original to me, that this crime, the climate crimes that I'm talking about, they actually go to another level and really do constitute crimes against humanity. And that is always a phrase, crimes against humanity, that one must use with caution. There have been so many of those crimes against humanity, the Nazi atrocities, the murders in Rwanda, you can go on and on and on. That it's a designation that one must be careful about invoking. But I think that in the case of climate change and the climate emergency, that definition fits. And as I say, this is not an original thought to me, although I have written it a number of times. I have been told this by high government officials in the US and abroad, both on the record and off the record over the years. For example, I think the first person who mentioned this to me is Hans Schellenhuber, John in English, John Schellenhuber, who was the top climate scientist for the government of Germany in the 90s and the 2000s, and remains, and also a top climate advisor to the British government at that point, and later was a top climate advisor to Pope Francis when Pope Francis issued his encyclical Laudato Si about the global environmental crisis. And Schellenhuber became a source of mine when I was doing work about 20 years ago now, writing for Vanity Fair about some of these climate criminals and the way that they were lying and using the tobacco industry's playbook to lie. And Schellenhuber was one of the scientists who was instrumental in the 1990s in establishing the so-called 2-degree limit. Back in the 90s, it was thought by him and other eminent scientists that we had to limit temperature rise to 2 degrees C. Beyond that would be radically dangerous. And then, of course, as more science has come in, they realized 2 degrees is not safe. Even 1.5 is going to be difficult. So John was one of the first people who said to me, this is a crime against humanity. Now, why did he say that? He said it because of a couple of things. One, crucially, as any lawyer or prosecutor will tell you, is that in this case, the alleged perpetrators, the oil companies in particular, they knew in advance what they were doing. They had full knowledge in advance that what their business plans called for, an increasing burning of fossil fuels for decades into the future, would fry the planet. You can look at a lot of investigative reporting on this. We now have the internal memos of these companies showing this, and their own words saying that this would, the scientists' words, and saying that this is going to basically create an uninhabitable Earth. So that's one thing. They had full knowledge in advance. The other thing, though, is that is the scope and scale of the damage. We're not talking about, you know, an individual murder, as tragic as that is. We're not talking about an individual town being wiped off the map, as horrible as that would be. We are talking about literally millions and millions and potentially hundreds of millions of people being deprived of their homes, being deprived of their livelihoods, being deprived of their very lives as extreme weather and temperature rise continues to accelerate around the planet. That's why Schellenhuber was talking about this. And for those who may be watching this and think, well, of course, he's a European, why should we listen to him? Let me bring up an American, Tim Wirth. Tim Wirth was the #3 official in the State Department during the Clinton-Gore administration. He helped negotiate the Kyoto Protocol, went on to run the United Nations Foundation, very active in international efforts on climate change. And Tim as well said on the record for a piece that I ran some years ago in Le Monde after former President Trump pulled out of the Paris Agreement. Tim Wirth also said, these are crimes against humanity because of the foreknowledge that the perpetrators had, which makes it intentional. In other words, it's not manslaughter, it's murder. And second, because of the vast scale of the damage. And then one third and very important voice here is Salim ul Haq. And Salim is one of the world's leading climate experts. He's an IPCC contributing author in Bangladesh, where he's a scholar and activist and works with the poorest of the poor, talking about how they can protect themselves against climate change. Adapt is the word that the scientists use. I mentioned a moment ago that Bangladesh and in the coastal areas in the south, because it's such a delta, flat delta, sea level rise now is forcing saltwater further and further inland. And what that's doing is making the ground salty. And so the rice yields, the people there don't have much choice about what they're going to plant, but so the rice yields are going down and down and down. And Salim has been saying for a number of years, and he addressed the last Glasgow climate conference, UN climate conference, and also the other one in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt. And he said, these are crimes against humanity, and that's how we need to think about them. So almost by definition, a crime against humanity is also a profound violation of human rights. Profound violation of human rights. And like many of these violations, not all crimes against humanity, but many of them, who gets targeted? Who suffers the most? If you were to put one word on it, it would be the unprivileged in our societies. What does that mean in practice? That means, above all, the poor of all nationalities, the poor of all colors, the poor of all creeds. If you are poor, you are far more likely to get hit first and worst by climate change. So that's one category, the poor. Also, people of color, even people of color who are not necessarily poor, are much more likely to be affected negatively by climate change. And another category that does not get the attention it deserves, women and girls. women and girls are overwhelmingly negatively affected by climate change. There's a lot of different reasons for that. If you're interested in learning more, I would request that you have a look at the weekly newsletter of Covering Climate Now called the Climate Beat. And I think it was, comes out every Thursday. So I think it was 3 or 4 weeks ago, where we devoted an entire issue to that question of the gender angle on climate injustice and human rights violations. And many examples of that, but one that is perhaps the most revealing is that when climate change causes extreme drought in areas, say in Africa, what that means is that the women of the village, whose job it is in those societies to go fetch water, they have to travel farther and farther and farther to get that water, which means that they tend to be alone and isolated on their walks back and forth, which puts them at much higher risk of assault, rape, and other nastiness. And you can find in that newsletter of ours a lot of references to United Nations studies, World Bank studies, and so forth that document all of this. But I would say that in addition to that voluminous knowledge, as a reporter, I have seen with my own eyes on the ground how climate change violates human rights, and especially the human rights of the underprivileged and the unprivileged. I think, for example, to being in Burkina Faso some years ago on a reporting trip. And again, of course, already a very hot place in the world, and climate change is only making it hotter. And I worked with a young man there who was a young radio producer. I was doing a piece for the World broadcast here, the PRI broadcast, the World, BBC PRI broadcast. And he was almost crying as he told me. I was asking him, so how is this experienced in your villages? And he only spoke French. And so I can still see his face, and he was anguished. He says, les vieux, meaning the old people, they suffer so much. And of course, that's another area of the unprivileged where the climate crisis hits the hardest, the very old and the very young. The weakest members of our society, and like almost all crimes against humanity in history, they are perpetrated by a tiny elite against masses of ordinary people. And it's an abomination. We've seen it all around the world. I saw it in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina. One more example before I sort of close up here is that one of the most important aspects of this is what is known as climate refugees. As climate change brings hotter weather and droughts and sea level rise and the destruction of livelihoods, people are forced to move. They don't want to move. Most people do not want to move. They do not want to take the risk of trying to get across a border to a new world, to a new country where they're not welcome. They only do it as a last resort. And again, through Covering Climate Now, our partner Al Jazeera English did one of the very best pieces on this. You can find it on our website. It actually won one of the Covering Climate Now Journalism Awards last year in 2022 for the best TV coverage of a climate issue. And it was set actually in Senegal of Western Africa. And they showed young men of the village there who, to their mothers, to their crying mothers' distress, saw no other option but to try to get to Europe. There were no livelihoods to be had in Senegal anymore. And so they would undertake the incredibly perilous trek, either across the Sahara or up around the boat to try to get into Europe. You've all seen the stories of the boats that either get turned back or that sink and drown these migrant refugees in the Mediterranean. That's what we're talking about with climate refugees. Those are human rights violations. That is part of this crime against humanity. And the United Nations says if we stay on our current track of both temperature rise and inadequate response to the humanitarian crisis of climate change, we're going to see potentially 1 billion climate refugees migrating across borders by 2050. That, of course, brings all kinds of knock-on effects with military conflict, xenophobia, all the things we've seen in this country as former President Trump tried to gin up racist anger against migrants coming from abroad. So I want to close, though, with what is the antidote to all this? What is the antidote to crimes against humanity and the human rights violations of climate change? Well, it starts with accountability. It starts with telling the truth about what is happening. Until you know what's happening, you can't logically do anything about it. And that is, of course, where the news media comes in. Not just the news media. We need lawyers, we need activists, we need solid citizens as well. But we in the media have a special role because nobody talks to more people, more often, more loudly than the news media. I said a moment ago that the Covering Climate Now reaches some 2 billion people around the world, our partners do. That's our role, is to inform those people that, A, this is a crime scene. You are living through a crime right now. There's the perpetrators in the executive suites of Exxon and BP and Shell and Chevron. And here's the crime. Here's the victims over here. Those poor young men trying to get across the border out of Senegal because they can't be farmers anymore. Or the young and not so young migrants coming out of Central America who also can't be farmers anymore because of the droughts that have destroyed the ability to grow corn, and on and on and on. So accountability, that is the essential first step to righting the wrongs of human rights violations, telling the truth about what has been done. And as I say, that is the role of the news media, among others. That is our civic role. We are to, as someone once said, our role is to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. Or as James Madison said, it is our role to arm the public with the power that knowledge gives. The power that knowledge gives. That's what we're trying to do with Covering Climate Now. We have a long ways to go. I don't want to suggest that we fix this by any means. We are making progress. We have broken climate silence, but the media is still way too climate quiet. But rest assured, we are working to change that as well. So I'm going to stop there, and I'll thank you for your attention and invite all of your questions. Please do not hold back from even asking critical questions. I've been a reporter all my adult life. I don't take it personally. So let's have an honest, robust discussion whenever you're ready. And Ken, thank you again for having me today.
Absolutely. Thank you, Mark, for just such a thorough and compelling presentation of, just our present state of being. And really, I think it was very helpful for the way in which you framed this as really a crime scene. I mean, and not something that should be treated as incidental, or that's something that you just kind of address looking at it, small, with a small scope, but there's a much larger frame in which to look at this, this climate catastrophe. One question I have for you is how do we engage, the public and to help them to comprehend the urgency of the moment, particularly when there are so many things vying at for people's attention. And also too, at a time in which, there's a real concern about civic engagement. I mean, one of the things that our office is doing is we're partnering with a number of local organizations and have created the Civic Engagement Coalition, just, looking at, beginning to explore ways to engage the public about why they should care, why it's important, for instance, to vote, when many people feel that their vote doesn't amount to anything. or why it's important to understand oneself as part of a larger whole.
Sure. Well, I think those are excellent questions. And I think that Ithaca actually is an excellent example of the positive side of that. And let's remember the positive side of these things. You and I were saying before we went on the air here that one of the great things, because you and I have known each other a long time, and we've been talking about these issues a long time. And one of the really positive developments of recent years, along with the so many negative ones, is that I can't remember a time when there have been more people who have been actively engaged in these questions of social justice, of climate justice. When Covering Climate Now was launching 4 years ago, we just coincidentally, we were very fortunate to launch the very same week that Greta Thunberg, a young Swedish teenager, put 6 million people in the streets around the world. Believe me, that got the attention of political leaders, but also news media leaders, right, who had been ignoring this story forever. But when they see 6+ million people in the streets, it was like, oh, I guess we better pay attention to this. And it's not just on climate. The protests, the street protests that broke out in 2020 after the police murder of George Floyd.
Yes.
Those were the biggest demonstrations, protests in the nation's history. They occurred in all 50 states. Yeah. And while they were generally and properly led by people of color, what was also striking was that there are a large number of white people who were part of those protests. In fact, Harry Belafonte, the great civil rights activist, singer, actor, of course, also, he wrote shortly after that in the New York Times that never have we had as many white allies in our fight for a world that is just and peace for all of us. And that, again, that's unprecedented. Never Appomattox have large numbers of white people literally put their lives on the line on behalf of Black people in the United States. So first of all, let's be aware that there is a lot of good happening. And that shows a lot more good can happen, that there are people who want to do what's right, whether it be on racism and its roots in slavery, whether it be about climate change and its roots in corporate greed or inequality or any of the number of the other issues that we care about. So sometimes it's easy to be negative about these things, but I think that's the first place to start. And from there, I think the next step is to think, okay, because of course, one is always asked this question, what can I do? What can I do? I mentioned my colleague, Bill McKibben, a few moments ago. I think Bill has a very good answer to this, is first of all, make sure that you don't try and do anything by yourself. There are lots of other people out there who are already doing something. You know, it's fine to recycle in your own house. It's excellent to, not use a car, but take mass transit, et cetera. But those kinds of individual changes, one-on-one, that's not sufficient to what we need. What we need is real political change, right? Big drivers of, the policies of government. And that means that you've got to get involved with others and you have to take political action. And one final thought there that is, again, I think reassuring, that history shows us, and these are scholars who are saying this, not Mark Hertsgaard, but history shows us that you don't need everybody.
That's right.
You generally need about 3.5% of the population, of a given population that is actually active, right? Not just sending in a check or voting, but doing something, going to a protest march, writing a letter, lobbying their members of Congress, et cetera. If you've got 3.5% of the population, which in the United States today would be about 10 million people, you can change that society. And I think that there's probably about that many people out there who are ready to do that. Question is, can we bring them in? Can we create a space that they feel welcome in, where you meet people where they are, not where you wish they were, but meet them where they are, and together try to go where we all have to end up.
I think those are great points, Mark, because, you're really kind of advocating looking at the glass as half full as opposed to half empty. And which I think is important because I think sometimes in terms of the way news is cycled and recycled, you don't always get the sense of like, okay, that there is resistance happening. I was watching a documentary, actually a documentary Greg Palast did about voter suppression, for instance, in Georgia, and how even in the midst of the efforts to undermine Latasha Brown, for example, said, who is the co-founder of Black Voters Matter, said that there is a new South rising, in resistance to this. And so I think that's important to keep that in mind. And I think that's where media coverage, I think, is important because it provides the good and holistic media coverage provides perspective.
Right. Well, and I see one of the questions in the chat sort of segues to that, which is, have we seen, the partners of Covering Climate Now, is their coverage actually changing? And I would, yes, their coverage is changing. It's definitely improving. You see now a lot more, you just see climate change mentioned a lot more than it ever used to be. Long way to go still. But one of the things that we are working with, especially the TV networks and their local TV stations on, is, to your point, Ken, is climate solutions. And in particular, climate solutions that are happening in people's own communities. The audience survey data shows that that's what people really want to hear about. They are tired of negative news. They are tired, especially of the "if it bleeds, it leads" approach to news, which means that, if some corner store owner gets held up by somebody and robbed, that somehow leads the 6 o'clock news every night. What people want is a fuller picture. And that's not, it's not our role as journalists to sugarcoat reality. That's not what I'm suggesting here. But solutions journalism, good solutions journalism, is what I say, telling the whole story. Yes, the problem. Yes, the fact that carbon emissions are going up, and yes, that is causing extreme weather around the world, but also the solution, which is we know how to change that. We can switch to solar and wind and actually save money by doing so. That's real solutions reporting. And I think when you do that, you not only serve the audience what the audience wants to know, and by the way, you also help the TV station's bottom line because you get more viewers, but you also do what's required for our civilization as a whole to survive. So we have seen these organizations do more. For example, at NBC, if any of you watch the Today Show, the morning show with the iconic weatherman Al Roker, you will see Al frequently now talks about climate change, even uses the term climate emergency frequently on the air. Likewise, CBS now has assigned a national environment and climate correspondent, Ben Tracy. Excellent work. You'll see it a lot on CBS Morning News, on the CBS Sunday News shows. So yes, there is improvement, but there is still a long way to go. And since I'm looking at the chat here, an example of stories that in the language used, one of the things that we are helping them to do, which frankly has been a real flaw in their coverage to date, is to what I call make the climate connection, especially when you're covering extreme weather. Like the terrible heat wave that was here in the West a couple of years ago, or the storms, or what have you. All of these things are now being driven to a greater or lesser degree by climate change. But you would not know that if you watched 80% of the network news coverage, which they cover those extreme weather events. You never hear the word climate change. Well, that is something we're working on with them. And we have literally said, okay, here's the 8 words, scientifically bulletproof 8 words that you can put into your news script without having to be a science reporter or a weather reporter. This is what the science says. And so those kinds of very practical helps, aids rather, are improving the coverage. But, we still have a long ways to go.
Yeah. Also, there's a question in the chat. How can people be more empowered to make good choices regarding things they consume? And what movement are you seeing on extended producer responsibility in terms of more sustainable product design?
Okay, so this raises the larger question about the dynamic between individual actions and collective actions. And as I said earlier, changing the way you consume as an individual is important, but insufficient. Or as Annie Leonard, the former head of Greenpeace USA, used to say, doing recycling and mass transit and so forth, those kinds of individual consumer choices is a great place to start getting active in the climate fight. But it is also a terrible place to stop. So we need to do both. It's really valuable to change your behavior, to eat less meat, to fly less, whatever it may be for you and your family. If only because it makes the climate issue part of your daily life. And it's something that you can talk to other people about. And by the way, as an individual, that's almost the most powerful thing you can do, is to talk about climate change. To talk about it with your family, with your friends, with your coworkers, with your neighbors. The latest social science research really underscores this point, because it shows that most Americans do not talk about climate change with others. Why? Not because they don't care. They actually do care. About 3/4 of them care about climate change. But because of the deniers and the climate liars behind the deniers, who've been very loud about saying that this is a hoax, the majority of people fear that, oh, I can't talk about this because most people don't agree with me. It's quite the opposite. Most people do agree with you, right? So one of the things that we tell news organizations, especially TV, when they say, oh, well, we don't want to be doing climate stories, because when we do, we get a lot of pushback from our viewers, angry phone calls and so forth. Well, here's, frankly, they're being duped by that, because here's the data, friends. And again, this comes from the Yale Climate Communications program, 15 years of data about Americans' views on climate change. 9%, it's 9% of the American public who feels like this is a hoax, the so-called dismissives, deniers. That's 9%. 91%, about half, 52%, are either alarmed or very concerned. And most of the others are interested, et cetera. So if you as a TV station are censoring yourself and not reporting climate change news because some people send you nasty emails or tweet, negatively about you, you have to realize you're making a very dumb business decision, because you are placating 9% of your audience and leaving 91% of your audience unsatisfied. And most Americans, about 3/4 of the American public, does want more information about climate change. So guess what? If you're not putting it on your television station, your competitor is, and you're going to lose audience to them. So that's just one example of how we as individuals are caught up in these crimes, right? We actually think, we lose confidence in our own feelings because we think we're alone. You're not alone. You are the majority. It's very much like what is happening on a national scale with the Republican Party. They're very loud, but they're very small, relatively, right? They're about 27% of the American population is pro-Trump at this point. So, if that's you're going to let them decide everything, you're going to silence yourself because of that. That's giving away your own power. The fact is that the majority of people do not agree with that. The majority of Americans do not agree with that, including on climate.
Well, it kind of reminds me of something that Lincoln said about the need to think and act anew, and in many ways, and that in that grappling with this reality, climate really requires us to do that. I mean, that's one thing that comes to mind. The second thing is something that I think is applicable, that Dr. King said, that it was always the creative minorities who were able to really produce change. And actually, we're talking about, well, they may be a minority, either in, let's say, percentage-wise of the population, but they but there are other people who join with them that makes their numbers larger to
True.
address the climate issue and to recognize too who is supporting and the amount of support that there is there, because this is something again that you don't hear much about in mainstream media.
Yeah, I think that's true. And as I say, we're trying to address that with our colleagues in the media. One of the things that Covering Climate Now, I think, has been very effective at is that we are journalists ourselves. We're organized by journalists for journalists. We're nonpartisan, nonprofit. And so as a result, when we talk to our colleagues at CBS, at NBC, at the LA Times, at NPR, wherever, CNN, we talk to them as fellow professionals, as journalists, colleague journalists. And they know, therefore, that we're not going to spin them, right? We're not activists. We're not government officials. We're not PR people. We're going to tell them, if we tell them, hey, here's a good story to check out, it probably is a good story to check out. And if we say, here's a source worth interviewing, and by the way, here's a source not worth interviewing, they listen to us because of that. I see here in the chat, since we're getting near the end of the hour, a question near to my heart. I mean, he says, you wrote the book Hot a few years ago, subtitled Living Through the Next 50 Years on Earth. And the question says, we're moving deeper into those 50 years. Did you expect that we would be further along in mitigating this crisis? Yes. Well, it's interesting you asked that. That book was motivated by the birth of my then baby daughter, who was 5 months old when I interviewed the chief science advisor to the British government, and who basically said that, we're going to be dealing with climate change for at least 50 years, even if we do everything right. And that was, my daughter just turned 18 last month.
Wow.
So, gone a long ways down that road. And sadly, we are not doing anywhere near enough. We're beginning to. The United States passed last year the biggest climate legislation in history. And that passed because of young people getting in the streets and skilled political leadership from people like Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Senator Markey, promoting the Green New Deal, which basically was the framework for the Inflation Reduction Act, and which they just, by the way, reintroduced today, that resolution, Markey and AOC did. So there's good things that are happening, but there's no question that we are a lot farther down the road of climate breakdown than I wish we were. And one good piece of news, though, that I was not aware of at the time of Hot, and the scientists weren't either, so I was just reporting what the scientists say, but a big shift that has happened in climate science in recent years is that we used to think that there was a long inertia, a lag time to the climate impacts, that even if you stopped emitting tonight, which is what that British science advisor told me, temperatures would still keep going up for another 25 to 30 years because of the long lead time that CO2 stays in the atmosphere. That was very depressing if you just had a baby girl, daughter. But we now know, and in fact, two colleagues of mine and I, Michael Mann and Salim Ul-Haq, who I mentioned earlier, we wrote about this in the Washington Post last year. We now know that, scientists know, I should say, that was mistaken. And that in fact, if you end carbon emissions or greenhouse gas emissions, including methane, tonight, there isn't this long lag time. It's actually in 2 or 3 years, the temperature rise stops. That is incredibly empowering scientific information, because it shows it's not hopeless. If you do phase out fossil fuels, if you do stop deforestation, if you do rewild a lot of parts of the world, and a lot of other things that we write about at Covering Climate Now, the solutions are there. If you do all those things and you bring emissions down to zero, the temperature rise halts. We can still limit the temperature rise to 1.5. That's what the science says. People who say we can't, they're talking about what they presume to be the political realities. But they ignore what history teaches us, which is that political realities can be changed, sometimes very quickly. by elections, by public protest, by skillful leaders, both people like Martin Luther King or people like Barack Obama, elected officials, what have you. Things can change. And there are millions of people around the world right now working very hard to change the supposed political realities of our time. That's, I think, the big story that the media needs to be covering, and without prejudging the outcome.
Got one last response in the chat. Says storytelling creates a level playing field to cross class, cultural, and ethnic boundaries to listen and discuss issues. Did you respond to that?
Storytelling is basically what we in the media are skilled at doing. And it's what we as humans have used to process reality for thousands of years. We tell each other stories about everything from, hey, after you get home from work, hey, dear, how was your day? Or, to your daughter, how was school today? And we tell one another stories. And I think that is one of our hopes in the face of the climate emergency. We say at Covering Climate Now to our colleagues in newsrooms around the world that the best climate coverage does three things. It humanizes, it localizes, and it solutionizes. Means it tells stories about human beings, not abstract numbers like 350 parts per million and 1.5 degrees. That stuff's important. But what really reaches each of us is not the information that goes here, it's the information that goes here. Right? And talking about real people. So humanize your stories and localize those stories. Yes, climate change is a global crisis, but it plays out locally, right? About the people that are in the local community. Your audience, the people that they know, that they can relate to. And then crucially, solutionize. Don't just talk about the problem. Talk about how you fix the problem. And that's all about storytelling.
Yes. No, that is so true. That is so true. I mean, people can connect up with a narrative. And it's important to listen to those narratives because they can inform.
How the bad guys have triumphed for 40 years is they put out a narrative that climate change was a hoax. And that narrative is very, very powerful. So we have to overturn that narrative. We have to delegitimate that narrative. But above all, we have to substitute a better narrative. And the irony is that we have the solutions. And those solutions, for the most part, are going to make life better. Wind and solar are cheaper than fossil fuel energy, right? And create more jobs for more people than fossil fuel energy. So all the tools are there. And I invite everybody who's listening to my voice right now to become part of this, to become part of making our society and our world a better place, a more just place, by fighting these violations of human rights, by calling out these crimes against humanity, but above all, by envisioning the better future that is there for us to grasp if we all work together.
Well, Mark, I want to thank you so much for this really great discussion, this storytelling we're engaged in today. And I want to thank our audience for having joined us and participating and for your questions. We will sign off now from our live broadcast and look forward to seeing our audience and others next month for our next round of programming coming from the Tompkins County Office of Human Rights. Thank you all so much. Have a good evening.
Thank you, Ken.
Yeah, thank you. It's great to see you as always.
And happy Earth Day, everybody.